Hey everyone! In this entry, we'll be taking a look at John Fitzgerald, the antagonist from The Revenant, inspired by, but not an accurate representation of his actual counterpart in real life. A hardened and calculative man, Fitzgerald's tale in the story is that of survival at the expense of others, with his crimes progressing in severity as the events unfold. Not long into the film, it's quickly established that Fitzgerald is a man who is more financially driven than his peers, which leads to a greater acceptance of risk by him. As their group was attacked by the tribal natives known as the Ree, everyone's natural response was to leave the pelts behind to maximize their chances of survival in the midst of the chaos. Fitzgerald, however, remains possessive of the pelts, and even with arrows flying left and right, he is instead found yelling at his peers not to abandon them. So right from the start, we see that unlike the rest of his group, Fitzgerald is someone who is willing to endanger himself for his payday. Beyond that, Fitzgerald also comes across as an opinionated man, believing that he knows what's best for the group and that he should call the shots. This naturally leads to much friction with his peers, given that Fitzgerald is willing to take on more risk than them. With the Ree on their tail, the journey ahead would be a perilous one, not to mention the fact that they have to survive against the harsh elements of the cold environment. Staying on the boat was Fitzgerald's preferred choice, but it wasn't a decision supported by Hugh Glass, the company's chartsman. The Ree owned the river, and staying on the boat would turn them into sitting ducks. But of course, Fitzgerald is all right with this, as staying on the boat would mean that they wouldn't have to lose the pelts. The decision to abandon the boat and correspondingly the pelts becomes a source of resentment for Fitzgerald. In his eyes, he blames Glass for the loss of his livelihood, which leads to his verbal insults with him and his son. It's not fully clear as to why Fitzgerald is so abnormally attached to the pelts. Of course, at face value, the pelts represent half a year's worth of work of toiling in the bitter cold of the wilderness. But everyone else was willing to sacrifice them if it meant their survival. From what is revealed to us, perhaps Fitzgerald is in dire financial straits compared to his peers. In his own words, "I ain't got no life. I just got living, and the only way I get that is through these pelts." There is also some hint of jealousy towards those in the upper class, when he mentions that he wished his dad was a doctor so that he could have bought him a captain's job. Twice in the film, we get some inkling of his endgame, namely to buy a nice piece of land in Texas and retire there. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with wanting a better life, but not if it comes at the expense of others. On top of this financial motivation, we see that Fitzgerald bears a noteworthy resentment against the Ree, which he then projects onto Glass. Being a victim of scalping by the Ree, with the scars on his head a constant reminder of his close brush with death, Fitzgerald is understandably hostile towards them. Glass becomes a second-hand recipient of this hostility, given that he has a son with a Native American wife and that he was allegedly linked with the death of a United States lieutenant. This hostility towards Glass is added on to his anger against him for the loss of the pelts. Perhaps all these factors partially came into play when Fitzgerald would later make his pivotal decision to execute Glass later. But of course, the greatest driver is his sense of self-preservation. In the condition that he was in after getting mauled by a bear, Glass was a huge liability to the team, and slowing them down could eventuate in their deaths either by the Ree or from the elements. Even the captain was tempted to execute Glass out of mercy, to end his suffering, and to ensure the group's survival. So it bears noting that in everyone's eyes, Glass was already seen as a dead man walking. In hindsight, it was a misguided perspective, but given the situation, it's understandable how the men would choose to abandon Glass. One man with a slim chance of survival was not worth risking the lives of the other 9 men. Ultimately, it's human nature for everyone to take care of themselves first by default, and it would be unwise of us to expect more. Unless their sense of compassion compels them, they are not obligated to put their lives on the line for him. However, if they were to voluntarily come to an agreement to care for Glass until his passing and give him a proper burial, and then be compensated for the act, then that changes everything. Being the financially driven man that he is, Fitzgerald takes up this position. It bears noting that he stands to gain 3 times that of the originally agreed amount, as Hawk and Bridger both willingly gave up their share of the reward to entice one more man. So suffice to say, Fitzgerald was getting well compensated for the risk he was taking. In light of this agreement to take care of Glass, Fitzgerald's act of choosing to execute him becomes all the more nefarious. Broadly speaking, there are 3 possible courses of action that he could take. First, he could simply fulfill his contract to the letter, and for a time it appears that Fitzgerald was intending to do so, but perhaps he wasn't expecting that Glass would have survived this long, and every second of delay is another moment that leaves them vulnerable to attack. The thing is, if he had just waited for another day, Glass would have found his strength, and all 4 of them could have continued together to the fort. There is much risk in this option, but then again, this is part of the agreement he signed up for. Secondly, if Fitzgerald is concerned over his own safety, he could renege on the agreement and simply abandon Glass just like all the other men did earlier. However, there is no way he could persuade Hawk or Bridger to abandon Glass as well, so he would have to go it alone. This would leave him as a solo man on his journey back to the fort, which isn't ideal, but what's worse is that he would have to forfeit the $300, which he most definitely would not agree to. We've seen that Fitzgerald has a rather strong inclination towards money, but perhaps it's also reasonable to suggest that he has an equally strong fear of the Ree, given that he has been scalped before, with such an event likely to have a traumatizing effect. The longer he stays out camping with Glass, the stronger the grip of paranoia. It's worth noting that part of his reason for migrating to Texas was because it's safer there, with Fitzgerald noting that while the natives there may steal his wallet, at least they won't resort to scalping him. So for Fitzgerald, the first 2 options aren't ideal. They would deprive him of either his safety or his money. The third option, however, as heinous as it is, would allow him to have both. Kill Glass quietly, making it appear that he passed on in his sleep, allowing Hawk and Bridger to move on, as well as him being able to collect the reward. But despite committing to the crime of killing Glass, Fitzgerald still desires to be seen as the good guy. He proposes it to Glass as a mercy kill, but by setting it up with the condition of blinking, he effectively makes it such that Glass can only convey a yes. It's as if Fitzgerald wanted to ease his own conscience by getting his permission, albeit in an underhanded way. It'd be interesting to see how the situation would have played out if Glass had simply shut his eyes and didn't open them again. Strictly speaking, that wouldn't constitute blinking, but then again, Fitzgerald would have likely just continued with the act anyway. Of course, if the situation were different, if the Ree were really surrounding them, then we couldn't possibly fault Fitzgerald for doing what he did. But the fact remains that there were no natives around at the time, and Fitzgerald was simply acting on his own impulse. In the course of the act, we also see another aspect of Fitzgerald, namely his concept of God, which we also see in the scene of his father's encounter with the squirrel. But here, his send-off for Glass is hardly comforting and somewhat laughable, telling him that maybe God will forgive his sins or maybe not, before smothering him while condemning him to the Almighty. Unfortunately, the situation is confounded when Hawk intervenes and Fitzgerald sees no way out but to kill him. At this point, even if Hawk's cries didn't alert the Ree to their presence, he would be sentenced to hang back at the fort for his attempted murder of Glass. With Hawk dead, Fitzgerald has no choice but to cancel his original plan to kill Glass. Having both Glass and his son dead would be too suspicious, so instead he convinces Bridger to flee with him. Despite his wicked deeds, It's notable that Fitzgerald appears to be at peace with himself. Later on, at the abandoned camp, after seeing the horses available, he comments that the Lord is on their side. This ties in with his concept of God, which appears to have been passed down from his father. From his recount of the story, Fitzgerald's father started off as an atheist before his epiphany, before the moment he claims he found God. As it turns out, he was saved from starving to death by his encounter with a squirrel. Given that the squirrel was labeled as the sublimity of mercy, we can gather that his father saw this encounter with the squirrel as an act of providence, one that spared his life. So in essence, like his father, Fitzgerald sees a favorable outcome as a sign of divine favor, hence the viewing of the horses as an indicator that God is on his side. Perhaps this in some way alleviates the guilt of his actions with Glass and Hawk earlier. And while this is speculative, perhaps this view of providence can explain a key moment with Fitzgerald, perhaps one of his more memorable ones. After Bridger finds out that he was lying about the Ree, a scuffle breaks out between the two, resulting in Fitzgerald holding Bridger at the end of his weapon. Fitzgerald decides to end Bridger's life as well, but after pulling the trigger, he realizes that the weapon cannot fire, and instead of trying some other means, he casually shrugs it off and comments on how lucky Bridger is and resumes the journey with him as if nothing happened. Now, of course, Fitzgerald would have several reasons for keeping Bridger alive, not the least of which is having a partner to survive with and having a witness to his testimony. But it's likely that those reasons were not part of Fitzgerald's decision to spare him at the moment. Even if they were, it still wouldn't really explain Fitzgerald's sudden change of attitude and how he casually changes his demeanor. As a suggestion, perhaps Fitzgerald saw the weapon being unable to fire as another sign from God, this time as a message that Bridger was to be spared. This ties in with the context of their conversation, as just seconds earlier Fitzgerald was declaring that he should be seen as God to Bridger, given that he saved his life earlier. And right before he pulls the trigger, he tells Bridger that God giveth and God taketh away. So clearly there is some notion of God in the act, albeit a misguided one. Hence, when the weapon failed to fire, perhaps Fitzgerald took the outcome as another sign of providence, just like with the squirrel and the horses. In closing, what makes Fitzgerald a villain? After he is found out, his crimes reach their pinnacle, with the robbery of his company's safe and the murder of Captain Dom Hall. But the pivotal moment of his downfall was his mistake with Glass, which already labels him guilty. At the worst, his actions are construed as murder. At best, he was downright dishonest for the breach of his agreement to care for Glass till his last breath. At the end, Fitzgerald poetically meets the fate he was trying to avoid, dying a gruesome death at the hands of other natives. So what do you think of Fitzgerald from the Revenant, folks? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and take care.